A bombed-out church in Normandy, 1944. Roof gone, walls half collapsed, rubble everywhere. For most people, this is destruction. For a squad of American soldiers caught behind enemy lines, it's home for the next 3 days. World War II wasn't just fought in trenches and foxholes. It was fought in the ruins of Europe's cities and towns. When advancing armies found themselves in devastated urban areas, they had to become builders as much as fighters. Not to construct new buildings, but to transform wreckage into survival shelters. From Stalingrad to Berlin, from Monte Cassino to Manila, soldiers on all sides developed techniques for turning bomb damage into defensive positions and temporary homes. They had no construction equipment, no building supplies, and often no time. Just rubble, ingenuity, and the desperate need for cover. The scale of destruction in World War II created an entirely new battlefield. By 1943, Allied bombing had reduced large sections of German cities to rubble. The Eastern Front saw systematic destruction as armies retreated and advanced. Cities became moonscapes of broken concrete and twisted metal. Yet within this devastation, soldiers found opportunity. Take Stalingrad, where the 6-month battle left 99% of the city destroyed. Soviet and German forces didn't just fight in the ruins, they lived in them. Through the brutal winter of 1942 to 43, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees, soldiers carved out living spaces in the skeletal remains of apartment blocks and factories. They learned that a collapsed building could provide better protection than an intact one. Rubble absorbed artillery blasts. Broken walls created natural firing positions. Debris fields slowed enemy advances. The Western Allies encountered similar conditions in Italy. The monastery at Monte Cassino, reduced to rubble by bombing, became a German fortress because of its destruction. The ruins provided better defensive positions than the original buildings. Allied forces advancing through Italian towns found every pile of rubble could hide a machine gun nest. Every collapsed house could shelter a squad. But defense wasn't the only concern. Soldiers needed protection from the elements. Rain, snow, and wind killed as effectively as bullets. In the ruins of Ortona, Canadian troops spent Christmas 1943 building shelters in destroyed houses while fighting room-to-room battles with German paratroopers. They learned to construct living spaces in the morning and fighting positions in the afternoon, all while under fire. The Pacific Theater brought different challenges. In Manila, American forces found a city deliberately destroyed by retreating Japanese forces. The tropical climate meant rain was constant, debris was unstable, and wooden structures had burned to ash. Soldiers had to adapt European rubble techniques to Asian materials and weather conditions. Urban warfare created a new type of soldier, part fighter, part engineer, part scavenger. Units developed specialists who could read damaged buildings like books, identifying which walls would stand and which would collapse. These skills weren't taught in basic training. They were learned through deadly experience. The irony was profound. The very weapons that created the destruction, artillery, bombs, demolition charges, made traditional military engineering impossible. There was no time to build proper fortifications. No supplies for conventional construction. Engineers trained to build bridges and clear minefields found themselves teaching infantry how to shore up damaged walls and create overhead cover from debris. This wasn't the warfare anyone had planned for. Pre-war military doctrine focused on movement and maneuver. Static positions were to be avoided. But in the rubble-filled streets of Europe's cities, movement meant exposure. Survival required stopping, digging in, and building up. Every soldier became a construction worker. Every destroyed building became raw material. The transformation happened gradually. Early in the war, troops tried to avoid urban areas altogether. But as the conflict intensified, cities became unavoidable objectives. Stalingrad, Warsaw, Berlin, these weren't just battles for territory. They were battles for survival in apocalyptic landscapes where the ability to create shelter from chaos meant the difference between victory and defeat. By 1944, specialized manuals circulated among Allied forces, documenting rubble shelter techniques learned from captured German positions and Soviet allies. The knowledge spread informally too, passed from veteran units to replacements. A corporal who survived Ortona could teach privates heading into Germany how to read blast patterns in broken walls. A sergeant from Stalingrad could explain how to mix brick dust with snow to create emergency mortar. The techniques crossed enemy lines. German soldiers studied Soviet rubble fortifications. Americans learned from German positions in Italy. British forces documented Japanese adaptations in Burma. War created a grim international exchange of survival architecture, with each side contributing innovations born from necessity. What emerged was a new form of military engineering, expedient, practical, and brutally effective. It required no supply lines, no special equipment, no formal training, just observation, adaptation, and the human instinct to create order from chaos. In the ruins of World War II, soldiers discovered that destruction itself could become construction material, that chaos could be organized into safety, and that survival often depended not on what you brought to the battlefield, but on what you could build from what you found there. Building a shelter from ruins starts with reading the rubble. Not all destroyed buildings are equal. Veterans quickly learned to identify which structures offered the best potential for conversion. The ideal ruin had partially standing walls, preferably load-bearing ones that wouldn't collapse further. Corner sections were prized because they provided two walls already connected at a stable angle. Soldiers looked for buildings with intact basements or cellars, which offered natural protection from artillery. But finding the right ruin was just the beginning. Understanding how to evaluate and use it safely required hard-won knowledge. The first rule was structural assessment. Before moving a single brick, troops had to determine what was holding the remaining structure up. One wrong move could bring tons of masonry down on their heads. They learned to spot keystone rubble, pieces that, if removed, would trigger a collapse. Veterans developed a sixth sense for dangerous structures. They could tell from the angle of a leaning wall whether it would stand another day or fall within hours. German pioneers in Russia documented their methods in field reports that survived the war. They identified 5 types of ruins, ranked by usefulness. Type 1. Buildings with all 4 walls partially standing in an intact basement. Type 2. Corner sections with 2 connected walls. Type 3. Single wall sections with rubble slopes on both sides. Type 4. Rubble piles with no standing walls but stable foundations. Type 5. Completely pulverized areas useful only for extracting materials. Materials came from the destruction itself. Broken timbers became roof beams. Door frames, somehow still standing in their openings, were carefully extracted and reused. Metal roofing sheets, twisted by explosions, could be hammered roughly flat and overlapped for weather protection. Even shattered furniture had value. Tabletops became walls, cabinet doors became windbreaks. The material hierarchy was clear. Steel beams were gold, strong, versatile, and resistant to fire. Wooden beams came second, though they needed careful inspection for damage and rot. Intact doors were precious, providing instant walls or roofs. Window frames, if the glass was gone, made excellent supports when reinforced. Radiators became stoves. Bathtubs became water collectors. Nothing was waste in a destroyed city. Soviet forces in Stalingrad became masters of rubble classification. They categorized debris by size and utility. Large blocks formed wall bases. Medium pieces filled gaps. Small rubble became chinking material. Pulverized brick mixed with snow created improvised mortar. Metal fragments were sorted, flat pieces for roofing, rods for reinforcement, pipes for chimney construction. German soldiers developed the rubble room technique. They would identify a corner where 2 walls met, clear a space roughly 8 feet by 8 feet, then build up the missing walls using broken bricks and mortar dust mixed with snow or water. The result wasn't pretty, but it kept out the -30-degree wind. These rooms could be built in 4 hours by an experienced squad, crucial when positions needed to be established before nightfall. The Americans in Italy perfected rapid assessment techniques. Advancing through destroyed towns, they had minutes to choose positions before enemy artillery found them. They learned to read blast patterns. Walls blown outward meant the building took a direct hit and remaining structures were weakened. Walls blown inward suggested external blast pressure, paradoxically often leaving stronger remains. Water damage assessment became crucial. In Northern Europe's wet climate, rain-soaked rubble was unstable and prone to sudden collapse. Soldiers learned to identify water infiltration patterns. dark staining on walls, efflorescence on bricks, wooden beams with visible rot, all were warning signs. Dry rubble was stable rubble. Fire damage presented different challenges. Burned buildings left chimney stacks standing like fingers pointing skyward, tempting shelter spots that were actually death traps, weakened by heat and ready to topple. Concrete structures exposed to intense heat spalled and cracked unpredictably. Metal beams could look intact, but fail under load, their strength destroyed by temperature extremes. Each army developed its own assessment priorities based on experience. British forces valued overhead protection most, traumatized by German 88mm airburst shells. Soviet troops prioritized warmth and concealment. Americans focused on multiple exits, lessons learned from being trapped in Italian mountain towns. Japanese forces in the Pacific emphasized drainage and ventilation in tropical conditions. Tools were improvised from battlefield debris. Helmets became buckets and shovels. Bayonets served as pry bars. Rifle butts hammered stakes. Entrenching tools, those small folding shovels every soldier carried, became the universal construction implement. Some units fashioned measuring devices from rifle slings marked at intervals, ensuring consistent wall heights and doorway widths. The selection process was methodical despite time pressures. Squads would spread out through a ruined area, each team assessing different structures. Hand signals communicated findings. Walls stable, basement intact, good overhead cover, water source nearby. The squad leader made final decisions based on tactical requirements and structural reports. By late war, this knowledge was formalized. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers published Field Expedient Shelters in Urban Terrain, documenting lessons learned in Italy and France. The manual included diagrams showing load distributions in damaged walls, charts for calculating rubble stability angles, and tables listing material strengths for common European building components. But manuals could only teach so much. Real expertise came from experience, from feeling walls vibrate under artillery fire, from hearing the grinding sound that preceded collapse, from recognizing the subtle lean that indicated imminent failure. Survival in the ruins required engineers' knowledge applied with soldiers' instincts, all while under enemy observation and fire. It was architecture at its most fundamental, shelter reduced to its essential elements of protection, stability, and time. The actual construction process followed patterns learned through deadly trial and error. First came the clearing phase. Soldiers removed unstable debris from their chosen space, creating multiple exit routes in case of collapse or attack. This wasn't random demolition. Every piece removed had to be evaluated for its effect on the remaining structure. Clearing began from the top down. Hanging debris was the immediate threat. Partially attached roofing, loose bricks wedged overhead, precariously balanced beams that could fall at any moment. Soldiers used long poles to dislodge dangerous materials from a safe distance. Sometimes rifle shots could bring down threatening pieces. Each movement was calculated. Remove the wrong stone, and an entire wall section might cascade down. Soviet combat engineers at Stalingrad documented their clearing methodology. 2 men worked while one watched specifically for movement in the structure above. The watchers rotated every 15 minutes. Fatigue dulled the awareness needed to spot tiny shifts that preceded collapse. They developed a vocabulary of danger. Dust trickling meant settling. Grinding sounds meant movement. Sudden quiet after creaking meant imminent failure. Next was the foundation. Rubble floors were treacherous, full of gaps that could twist ankles or hide grenades. Soldiers would lay the flattest pieces of debris they could find, creating a roughly level surface. Smaller fragments filled the gaps. In winter conditions, snow mixed with brick dust created a crude cement that froze solid. The foundation extended beyond the shelter walls, creating approach paths that wouldn't shift underfoot during night movements. The foundation served multiple purposes. Level floors prevented water accumulation. Stable surfaces allowed ammunition stacking without risk of avalanche. Properly laid foundations distributed weight, preventing heavy equipment from punching through to hidden voids below. German reports from the Eastern Front described soldiers falling through false floors into basements flooded with sewage or occupied by enemy troops. Wall construction used a technique called dry stacking. Without proper mortar, soldiers relied on gravity and careful placement. Larger pieces formed the base, with progressively smaller pieces above. The gaps between stones were chinked with cloth, paper, or smaller rubble to block wind. American forces in Italy discovered that empty ration cans filled with dirt made excellent building blocks. Uniform size, stackable, and available in endless supply. Each wall layer was corbelled slightly inward, creating inherent stability. Soldiers learned the critical angles through experience. Too vertical and walls toppled outward. Too slanted and interior space became unusable. The sweet spot was a 5 to 10 degree inward lean, creating walls that supported themselves and any roof load. Corner construction required special attention. These junction points bore the most stress and failed first under artillery bombardment. Soldiers developed interlocking patterns, alternating stones between walls like zipper teeth. Metal reinforcement helped. Salvaged rebar, twisted bed frames, even barbed wire wrapped around cornerstones. The strongest corners used salvaged steel beams as vertical posts with rubble filled between. Window and door openings weakened walls, but were necessary for observation and movement. Lintels above openings carried tremendous weight. Soldiers searched for single strong pieces, steel I-beams, concrete slabs, even thick wooden doors turned sideways. Lacking proper lintels, they created corbelled arches, each stone projecting slightly over the one below until they met its center. Interior supports were crucial for any span over 6 feet. Wooden posts were preferred, but soldiers used whatever stood vertical: metal pipes, stacked furniture, even rubble-filled ammunition boxes. Support placement followed battlefield logic, never directly in front of openings where blast pressure concentrated, always with backup supports in case primaries failed. Roofing was the greatest challenge. Most soldiers settled for partial coverage, enough to keep out rain or snow over sleeping areas. Timber beams salvaged from wreckage would span the shortest distance between walls. These were covered with whatever flat material could be found: doors, signs, corrugated metal. Everything was held down with heavy rubble to prevent it from blowing away or being lifted by blast pressure. Waterproofing used battlefield materials. Shelter halves and raincoats became vapor barriers. Tar paper from destroyed roofs was prize material. Lacking proper waterproofing, soldiers created drainage systems, angling surfaces to channel water away from living spaces. They learned that accepting some water infiltration was better than creating sealed spaces that collected blast pressure. Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad added unique elements: firing positions. They would build their shelters with carefully placed openings that provided fields of fire while maintaining cover. Some positions had multiple levels, with sleeping areas below and fighting positions above. These kill holes were reinforced with extra stones, angled to deflect return fire while allowing outgoing shots. Heating came from improvised stoves. German helmets with holes punched for ventilation became braziers. Ammunition cans with crude chimneys heated small spaces. Larger shelters used elaborate systems: radiators salvaged from buildings, pipes running under floors for radiant heat, even captured vehicle engines run briefly to generate warmth. Ventilation was critical. Carbon monoxide killed as surely as bullets. The British and Italy developed modular construction methods. Standard room sizes allowed pre-planning of material needs. 8 feet square became the norm, large enough for 4 men, small enough to heat, possible to roof with available materials. Standardization meant experienced teams could erect basic shelters in 2 hours, leaving more time for improvements and fortification. Camouflage was integral to construction. Fresh rubble looked different from weathered debris. Soldiers learned to match their construction to surroundings, using soot to age new surfaces, scattering debris to break up regular patterns. The best shelters were invisible until you stood at their entrance. Some German positions in Cassino were undiscovered until after the battle, despite Allied troops passing within meters. By 1944, construction techniques had evolved into doctrine. Time estimates became predictable: 2 hours for basic weather protection, 4 hours for fortified positions, 8 hours for command posts with multiple rooms. Material requirements were standardized: 50 stable blocks per wall section, 20 linear feet of beam per room, 100 pounds of chinking material per shelter. But statistics couldn't capture the human element. Exhausted soldiers building shelter after 36 hours without sleep. Construction under sniper fire, every movement potentially fatal. Racing approaching darkness. Knowing incomplete shelters meant freezing death. The rubble shelters of World War II were built with more than stones and debris. They were built with determination, desperation, and the fundamental human drive to create protection from chaos. Life in a rubble shelter was harsh, but infinitely better than exposure. Soldiers developed daily routines adapted to their improvised homes. Water collection became crucial, helmets and cans positioned to catch rain, or snow melted in whatever containers survived. Every drop mattered in cities where water mains had been shattered and wells contaminated with sewage from broken pipes. Morning routines began before dawn. The first man awake checked structural stability. Overnight settling, new cracks, signs of weakness that developed in darkness. Frost could split stones. Rain could undermine foundations. Enemy artillery during the night might have weakened supports without obvious damage. This daily inspection became ritual, each man memorizing his shelter's quirks and danger signs. Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad faced unique challenges. With temperatures hitting -40, everything froze. Food, water, weapons, even breath condensing on shelter walls created ice sheets that had to be chipped away. They learned to sleep in shifts, maintaining small fires constantly. Bodies were never recovered from sleeping bags. Frozen zippers meant death from exposure. Instead, soldiers slept fully dressed, weapons at hand, ready to fight or flee instantly. Food storage and preparation adapted to rubble living. Rations were cached in multiple locations, some near cooking areas, others in hidden reserves. Soldiers learned that concentrated stores attracted rats and artillery. Distributed supplies meant survival even if part of the shelter was destroyed. Cooking happened in shifts, smoke carefully managed. Chimney placement became art. Visible smoke brought mortars, but poor ventilation meant suffocation. German forces documented their shelter routines in surprising detail. Water was filtered through sand and charcoal-filled helmets. Latrine areas were established downwind and downstream. Lime from pulverized plaster used for sanitation. Weapons maintenance schedules doubled in dusty environments. Ammunition was rotated regularly. Moisture from earth floors could corrode cartridges within days. The shelters were never permanent. Most were occupied for days or weeks before front lines shifted. But some, particularly in prolonged urban battles, became elaborate. German soldiers trapped in the Courland pocket built multi-room complexes in ruins, complete with underground tunnels connecting positions. These evolved into underground cities with designated areas for cooking, sleeping, ammunition storage, and medical treatment. American forces in Italy discovered that rubble shelters developed their own microclimates. Moisture from breathing and cooking condensed on cold walls, creating constant dampness. Soldiers learned to create air circulation patterns, using battlefield debris as crude ventilation ducts. Ammunition boxes with bottoms removed became air channels. Shell casings served as chimney extensions. Medical challenges in rubble shelters were severe. Dust caused respiratory problems. Unstable surfaces led to injuries. Poor sanitation spread disease. Battalion aid stations established in ruins faced unique problems. How to maintain sterile conditions in environments made of dirt and debris. Medics improvised, using captured parachute silk for dust barriers, creating operating areas with multiple layers of shelter halves, boiling instruments in German helmets. British forces advancing through Italy found that previous occupants, whether Allied or Axis, had often improved ruins in similar ways. A kind of battlefield architecture evolved, with each army learning from others' techniques. Intelligence officers could sometimes determine which army had sheltered in ruins by construction methods used. Americans favored multiple exits. Germans built elaborate firing positions. Soviets prioritized thermal efficiency. Communication between shelters required innovation. Telephone wires were impossible to maintain in rubble. Shifting debris cut lines constantly. Runners faced exposure and sniper fire. Soldiers developed sound-based signals using debris as instruments. Tapping on pipes carried through rubble better than voices. Mirror fragments became heliographs. Even smoke signals returned, using different materials to create colors, rubber for black, oil-soaked rags for white. Social dynamics in confined spaces tested unit cohesion. 4 to 6 men sharing 64 square feet for weeks created tensions. Successful units developed strict protocols. Personal space was sacred. Each man had his corner, his gear arrangement, his sleeping spot. Duties rotated religiously: fire watch, security, maintenance, cooking. Natural leaders emerged, usually veterans who understood that survival required cooperation over rank. Entertainment and morale became crucial. Soldiers created games from debris, chess sets from carved rubble, playing cards from ration boxes. Books were passed between shelters until they fell apart. Letter writing happened by firelight, pages carefully protected from moisture. Some shelters had gramophones salvaged from ruins, soldiers sharing precious records that survived destruction. These improvised engineering skills had lasting effects. Veterans returning home brought knowledge of expedient construction that influenced post-war rebuilding efforts. In devastated cities across Europe, civilians used similar techniques to create temporary homes in bombed buildings while waiting for reconstruction. The Marshall Plan's housing initiatives incorporated lessons learned from military rubble shelters: quick construction, salvaged materials, adaptable designs. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who spent months in ruins developed different relationships with destruction. They saw potential where others saw devastation. A collapsed building wasn't tragedy, but opportunity. This mindset helped post-war recovery. Veterans working in construction brought practical knowledge of load-bearing, material stress, and improvised engineering that formal education couldn't provide. Military doctrine permanently changed. Urban warfare training now includes rubble navigation and shelter construction. Modern armies study World War II techniques, adapting them to contemporary materials and weapons. The basic principles remain unchanged: assess, adapt, survive. Special forces particularly value these skills, knowing that high-tech equipment fails, but rubble remains universal. The ability to create shelter from destruction became a defining skill of urban warfare. It represented human adaptability at its most basic level: the drive to create order from chaos, safety from danger, and small spaces of control in total war. Modern military engineers study Stalingrad and Monte Cassino not just as battles, but as laboratories where desperate innovation created new forms of architecture. Today's conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine echo these lessons. Soldiers and civilians alike build shelters in ruins using techniques pioneered in World War II. The materials change: concrete apartment blocks instead of brick townhouses, but principles endure. Gravity still determines stability. Water still follows predictable paths. Humans still need protection from elements and enemies. The rubble shelters of World War II stand as testament to human ingenuity under extreme conditions. Built without blueprints or building codes, without safety equipment or construction machinery, they kept soldiers alive through some of history's most destructive battles. They were architecture stripped to its essence, not about beauty or permanence, but about survival. In the ruins of total war, soldiers discovered that destruction itself could become construction material, that chaos could be organized into safety, and that the human drive to create shelter could triumph even in humanity's darkest hours.